Atonement. Chapter 1. The old Victorian mansion stood ominous and foreboding against the gloomy gray sky. Jessica squeezed Mark's hand anxiously as they pulled into the long, winding driveway that led up to their new home. "It's beautiful," said 10-year-old Emma from the back seat, her nose pressed against the window. "It looks like a haunted house." Mark chuckled as he put the car in park. "Don't worry, sweetheart, there's no such thing as ghosts." The family of 5 stepped out and stared up at the imposing 3-story house. The windows were dark and empty like hollow eyes. A cold wind whistled through the naked tree branches surrounding the property. "Let's go inside," Mark said, rubbing his hands together briskly. The realtor had left the key under the mat. The heavy front door creaked open. Their footsteps echoed through the cavernous foyer. Cobwebs clung to the chandelier. A fine layer of dust covered the ornate woodwork. "It just needs some TLC," said Mark. "We'll fix it up in no time." Jessica felt a chill run down her spine that had nothing to do with the drafts. The house seemed to watch them with a brooding silence. Upstairs, the nursery had faded circus wallpaper that delighted 8-year-old Tyler. Baby Grace would sleep here in her crib beneath the window. As the afternoon waned into evening, the October wind rattled the windows. Tree branches scraped the sides of the house. That night, as Jessica nursed the baby, the unfamiliar creaks and groans of the old house kept her on edge. Something about this place didn't feel right. Chapter 2. Over the next few days, the family settled into the strange new house. Mark left each morning for his new job in town, while Jessica stayed home with the children. She kept busy decorating and unpacking boxes, trying to make the unusual house feel like a home. But small, disturbing events continued mounting. At breakfast one morning, Jessica stepped out of the kitchen for just a moment to soothe the crying baby. When she returned, the faucet was running full blast, overflowing the sink and spilling water all over the floor. No one admitted to turning it on. Later that week, Emma screamed when she opened her closet and found all her dresses ripped from the hangers, strewn across the floor. "It must have been the wind," Mark offered reasonably. But the windows had been shut tight. At night, trespassers seemed to invade the house while they slept. Jessica often awoke to find chairs out of place, cupboard doors wide open. One morning, muddy footprints led from the front door all the way up to the nursery. The activity centered around the nursery, where Grace now slept through the night. Jessica dreaded going in there alone. She felt cold presences swirling around the crib. Ancient responders seemed to watch from the darkened corners. Grace often woke crying hysterically, as if sensing things her mother could not. One night, Jessica passed by the closed nursery door and heard the distinct sound of 3 children singing a nursery rhyme from within. She burst through the door, heart pounding. But the room was still and empty, the antique dolls slumped lifeless on their shelves. Grace slept soundly in her crib. Mark remained unconcerned, refusing to entertain any notion of the supernatural. But Jessica knew something was very wrong with this house. She begged her husband to move, but he insisted it was all in her imagination. Chapter 3. Shadowy events continued plaguing Jessica, increasing in frequency and intensity, all centered around the second-floor nursery. One night, unable to sleep, she went downstairs to make some chamomile tea. The wind howled outside, rattling the window panes. As she ascended the staircase, tea mug in hand, She glanced up at the dark second-floor landing. A tall, shadowy figure stood motionless at the end of the hall. Two red eyes floated in the darkness, watching her. Jessica froze, every muscle seizing up in primordial terror. The mug slipped from her hand, shattering on the stairs. The thing at the end of the hall didn't move. Heart pounding, Jessica fumbled for the light switch, flipping it on. The hallway remained empty. She rushed to the nursery, turning on every light. No intruder was there. Grace slept soundly in her crib, undisturbed. The wind wailed outside. "What's going on?" Mark stumbled from their bedroom, squinting against the bright light. "There was someone here at the end of the hall," Jessica said, voice quavering. Mark checked the doors. All locked. He inspected every closet and corner, while Jessica clutched Grace tightly. Nothing. "You must have imagined it," he said. "This old house plays tricks on your mind." But Jessica knew what she saw. Something menacing lurked on the nursery hallway, appearing only under the veil of darkness. She would not let it harm her baby. The next morning, she gave Mark an ultimatum: move out or she was taking the children to a hotel. He reluctantly agreed to consider selling the house on one condition: they speak to a professional first. Chapter 4. Mark invited Madame Vesta, a renowned medium, to come inspect the house. She arrived dressed entirely in purple, smelling of incense and cigarettes. Her heavily lined eyes probed the shadowed corners. Madame Vesta wandered the house for over an hour, running her hands along the walls, murmuring to herself. Jessica followed close behind, cradling Grace. The older children trailed at a distance, watching the strange woman with curiosity. At last Madame Vesta turned to them. "You're right to want to leave this place," she rasped in her smoke-damaged voice. "There are powerful forces here, filled with rage and pain." Their eyes widened. Mark shifted uncomfortably. "Many years ago, another family lived here, the Marshalls," she continued. "They had 3 children who all died of typhoid in one summer. It drove the parents mad with grief. When the mother learned she could never have more children, she committed suicide in the nursery." Jessica gasped, glancing at the room where Grace played each day, oblivious to its sinister history. "All 3 spirits remain trapped in this house," said Madame Vesta. "Their grief has twisted into evil. They mean to harm you, especially the baby." Jessica clutched Grace tightly. Mark looked uneasy. "You must leave immediately," Vesta implored. "Once a ghost turns vengeful, there is little to be done. This place is dangerous." Mark hesitated, but Jessica had heard enough. She began packing their bags that very night. Chapter 5. Mark refused to leave. He did not believe Madame Vesta's grim story about ghosts seeking vengeance. The next evening, their bags still sat neatly packed by the door while the family ate dinner in uneasy silence. "Please, Mark, I want to leave," Jessica implored later as they prepared for bed. "And go where?" Mark asked in frustration. "We invested our whole life savings into this house. We can't just walk away. Our safety is more important." "I still think there's a rational explanation for all this," he said. "Old houses have quirks. It will pass once we settle in." Jessica knew with cold certainty that it would only get worse. But Mark could not be swayed. That night, Jessica lay rigidly awake as the wind howled outside. The house creaked and groaned ominously. At last, she slipped into uneasy dreams. Crash. A deafening boom jolted her upright in bed. Mark leapt up beside her. Heavy footsteps pounded up the stairs. Their bedroom doorknob rattled violently. Mark charged forward and wrenched open the door. The hallway stood empty, bathed in moonlight. Silence rang in their ears. "Must have been the wind," whispered Mark uncertainly. "No more," shouted Jessica. "I'm leaving tomorrow with the children, with or without you." She would drag him out by force if she had to. This evil house would not claim her baby's life. But Mark still refused to accept the truth. He believed rationality could conquer the irrational if he ignored it long enough. Jessica knew they were out of time. Chapter 6. The next evening, Mark sat grimly observing as Madame Vesta prepared for a séance in the parlor. Incense smoked from a small bowl on the round table. "We will try to make contact and convince the spirits to move on," said Vesta. Jessica clutched Grace on the sofa, Tyler and Emma close beside her. The medium closed her eyes, breathing deeply. The candles flickered, casting wavering shadows onto the walls. "Spirits of the Marshall house, we call to you," intoned Madame Vesta. "Tell us what holds you here that we may help you find peace." For several moments, nothing happened. Then a sharp bang sounded from upstairs, making them jump. The candles flickered out, leaving them in darkness. Madame Vesta lit them again with a lighter. As soon as the flames rose, the table began shaking violently. They all stared with frightened eyes as it rocked back and forth on the floor. Then the medium's eyes shot open, and she let out a choked gasp. A gruff man's voice emerged from her mouth. "This is our house," it growled. "Leave or suffer the fate of those who came before." The table slammed back down. Jessica clutched the children close as Vesta snapped out of her trance, breathing hard. "A vengeful spirit possesses this place," she whispered. "We must flee immediately. Follow me to the car." They gathered their packed bags and hurried outside to the safety of the night. The house loomed up behind them, every window now lit with an eerie red glow. Chapter 7. 3 days passed in anxious limbo at a local motel. Mark still refused to sell the house. He was convinced the events had rational explanations that he could discover in time. Madame Vesta had washed her hands of them, refusing to return. But Mark hired a pair of amateur ghost hunters, Tucker and Dale, to spend a night investigating. Jessica awaited their report anxiously. Around midnight, the ghost hunters came racing from the house, faces white. "Lady, that place is seriously messed up," Tucker gasped. "We got violent paranormal activity in every room." "Something wants you out," added Dale. "You couldn't pay us enough to go back in there." But Mark remained stubbornly unconvinced. "They're just guys with gadgets that defect pipes and wiring. There has to be a scientific explanation." He brought in electricians and plumbers to inspect the disturbances. They emerged scratching their heads, unable to find any issues. Yet Mark's resolve only grew stronger. "Whatever is happening, it's in our minds," he told Jessica. "We can't let fear and superstition rule our lives." She knew confronting this evil head-on would only bring disaster. But she had no choice. Mark was the breadwinner. If he lost this house, their whole future would be jeopardized. They returned to the mansion, the dreaded nursery upstairs now silent and still. But as Jessica rocked Grace to sleep that first night back, she sensed the spirit's wrath growing. This was only the quiet before the true storm began. Chapter 8. Mark invited Dr. Wells, their family physician, to stay overnight and observe their concerns firsthand. Jessica hoped the doctor would talk some sense into her husband. That evening, Dr. Wells conducted a thorough examination of the house, taking notes and photographs. As he inspected the nursery, a loud crash made them whirl around. An antique doll lay smashed on the floor beneath its shelf. "Odd," muttered Dr. Wells, adjusting his glasses. "Perhaps a vibration dislodged it." At 1 a.m., Jessica led the doctor upstairs when Grace woke crying. This time, her crib actually shook back and forth on its own, rattling violently against the floor. Dr. Wells' eyes widened. He stepped forward to stop the crib's convulsions, nearly tripping over a toy train that shot out from under the crib on its own, circling the room. As Jessica grabbed her screaming baby, the bedroom door suddenly slammed shut, locking them inside. Dr. Wells tugged desperately on the knob. "There must be an explanation," he said uncertainly. "Old houses. Please, help us convince my husband we must leave," Jessica implored over Grace's cries. At breakfast, the doctor took Mark aside. "I cannot medically explain what I witnessed," he said gravely. "For your family's health and safety, you would be wise to abandon this place." Mark's calm facade finally crumbled. "Then you believe it is supernatural," he whispered. "I know not what it is," said Dr. Wells. "Only that it is dangerous." Mark's shoulders slumped in defeat. Finally, he was ready to leave this evil house for good. Chapter 9. Mark made arrangements to stay at his brother's home until they could find a new house. This would be their final night in the haunted mansion. After the children were tucked into bed, Mark and Jessica stayed up late packing. Both jumped nervously at every creak and groan of the old house. "Just one more night," Mark said wearily after they went upstairs. Jessica squeezed his hand, heart thudding. Back in the master bedroom, an icy breeze swirled through the room despite closed windows and the heat on full blast. The curtains billowed where there was no draft. They changed hurriedly with their backs to each other, shivering. As Jessica pulled on her nightgown, bony fingers suddenly gripped her wrists from behind. She screamed and spun around. Nothing was there. Mark grabbed her shoulders, eyes darting around. "We're getting out of here tomorrow," he said firmly. They climbed into bed, clutching each other tightly. Neither slept that night. At dawn's first light, they began loading up the minivan. The house seemed to watch them silently from its darkened windows. Then, as Mark went back inside for a final load, a loud smash came from the nursery. He and Jessica raced upstairs and burst through the nursery door together. Grace's crib lay upended. The rocking chair crashed into the wall, skipping back and forth violently. As they stood paralyzed in the doorway, the bedroom window suddenly exploded outward. "Go," Mark yelled, shielding Jessica as shattered glass rained down. This evil house was not letting them escape unscathed. Chapter 10. They raced downstairs and out the front door. As Mark loaded the last bags into the minivan, a ferocious wind erupted from nowhere, nearly blowing them over. Dark clouds amassed uncannily fast, blotting out the morning sun. Thunder cracked and rolled as Mark and Jessica scrambled to buckle the confused, frightened children into their seats. The first fat raindrops splattered the windshield. As Mark slid behind the wheel, a jagged lightning bolt fractured the sky, striking their car and igniting the engine. They leapt out and watched helplessly as the minivan went up in flames. The storm swirled violently around the house, lashing the walls and slamming the doors. "We'll have to ride out the storm inside, then walk to town," Mark shouted over the screamed wind. Jessica stared at him in horror. But they had no choice. Back inside, furniture shook and picture frames crashed off the walls as they huddled in the parlor. The children screamed and sobbed. Boom! Lightning struck the house repeatedly, electricity surging through the walls like neural impulses. The foundation rocked beneath their feet. Jessica curled around Grace in mortal terror. This was no ordinary storm. It was a supernatural siege against their escape. "Go away! Please let us go!" she screamed into the void. A cruel, inhuman laughter echoed all around them in response. The tempest raged on as the walls trembled and heaved in the endless thunder. They clung to each other helplessly as the entity laid siege to their minds and bodies, determined to consume them all. Chapter 11. At long last, the thunder slowly faded away. The winds died down until only the patter of rain echoed through the rattled house. As the gray dawn light filtered in, Jessica raised her head shakily. The children were frozen in traumatized silence, eyes round with shock at what they had witnessed. "Is it over?" whispered Emma. Before Jessica could reply, a blood-curdling scream ripped through the silence upstairs. She clasped her children close as heavy footsteps pounded over their heads. Mark jumped up to investigate, but Jessica grabbed his hand desperately. "It's already gotten inside you once," she cried. "This evil is stronger than we realized. We need help." Mark hesitated, then nodded. "All right, you wait here while I walk into town and bring the police back," he said. "They can escort us out." Jessica's chest tightened. "Please be careful," she whispered. She kissed him fiercely, then watched him disappear out the front door. The minutes crawled by endlessly. Jessica nearly jumped out of her skin as a child's giggle echoed from the top of the stairs. "Who's there?" she called out shakily. Only silence answered. She knelt on the floor, clutching her children close and praying for Mark's swift return. At last she heard the front door bang open. Heavy boots clomped through the foyer. Mark entered with 2 police officers. "Thank God," Jessica sobbed, running into his arms. "You folks ready to leave this place for good?" asked Officer Wilkes gruffly. Jessica nodded vehemently. The officers escorted them outside and waiting cruisers flashed their lights. But as Mark went to lock the front door, a gunshot rang out from inside the house. Jessica screamed. They rushed back in to find Officer Wilkes crumpled at the base of the stairs, blood pooling around his head. "His gun just flew out of the holster and went off," gasped Officer Hayes. Before their stunned eyes, the pistol rose from the floor and pointed directly at them. They all turned and fled as if fired again and again, bullets burying in the walls around them. Outside, the officers led Jessica and the children swiftly down the drive while Mark supported Officer Wilkes. Dark forms darted between the trees around them. The house had turned murderous, determined to stop their escape. But they pressed onward through the woods, finally reaching the cruisers just as Wilkes went limp in Mark's arms. It was too late to save him. Their refuge in sight, Jessica suddenly felt an icy grip around her throat, cutting off her breath. Mark turned back in time to see her lifted straight up into the air, legs kicking violently. Chapter 12. Mark shouted and grabbed Jessica's legs, trying to pull her down. She gasped for air, clawing at the invisible hands strangling her. The children screamed. As Mark struggled to break the ghostly grip, Officer Hayes raised his gun towards Jessica. "Shoot it," Mark yelled desperately. "I can't get a clear shot," cried Hayes. Jessica felt the malignancy all around her, savoring her terror. "Let her go," Mark screamed into the void. "Take me instead." The strangling hands suddenly released. Jessica collapsed, gasping for breath. Before anyone could stop him, Mark sprinted back towards the house. "Mark, no." She staggered to her feet, but Hayes held her back. "It's too late, ma'am," he said sadly. "I'm sorry." Jessica collapsed to the ground, sobbing. She had failed to protect her family from this evil. And now it had claimed her husband too. Inside the house, all fell silent. The remaining officer stayed with Jessica, and the children hunkered miserably in the back of the cruiser. They all looked up sharply as the front door creaked open. For a moment, Jessica thought she saw 3 small children peering out. Then the door slowly swung shut once more. Minutes later, just as they were giving up hope, Mark emerged ragged and stunned, but alive. "The ghost vanished once I returned," he said breathlessly. "It wanted to separate us, that's when it was strongest, but together we have power over it." Officer Hayes examined the estate grounds, but found no trace of the malevolent haunting. For now at least, the entity appeared to have withdrawn. With all of them gone, it had no more prey. Hand in hand, weakened but wiser, the family walked down the long drive, leaving the cursed house behind. Chapter 13. In the following weeks, Jessica gradually recovered from the nightmarish ordeal. But she knew they could never fully leave it behind them. The haunting would forever linger as a shadow over their family. Mark sold the mansion at a huge loss, unable to disclose its diabolical history to buyers. Instead, they warned it was structurally unsound, ensuring no one would ever inhabit it again. They bought a modest but cozy home nearby, trying to restore a sense of normalcy. But it wasn't easy. The children were withdrawn, subject to fits of panic. And Jessica struggled with anxiety and depression. She nearly jumped out of her skin each night at sounds that reminded her of the entity. Whenever the wind howled, she had to resist the urge to take the children and flee. Sensing her hypervigilance, Mark tried his best to make their new home feel safe. He installed an alarm system, night lights in every room, and solid locks on the doors and windows. During the day, he encouraged Jessica to engage in hobbies, meet new friends, and see a counselor. Slowly, the warm comforts of their new community eased her fears. She let herself be vulnerable again, like a closed flower gradually reblooming. Mark found meaning by researching paranormal phenomena, seeking to understand what had happened. He now knew unequivocally that human perception has limits. Some mysteries defy understanding. As their children played happily once more, Jessica took hope. The evil presence was behind them. She and Mark grew closer than ever, bonded by the shared darkness they had conquered together through sacrifice and love. They would never again take their beautiful family life for granted. The past could not be changed, but the future was theirs to shape. Chapter 14. On a crisp Saturday in late October, Jessica loaded the children into the minivan. They were headed 2 hours north to the scenic Green Mountain Inn for a weekend getaway. Emma and Tyler played I Spy while Grace napped in her car seat. The bright autumn foliage flew by outside. Jessica took a deep breath, trying to focus on the drive. Mark stayed home to work, but encouraged her to take the kids and enjoy a change of scenery. She knew he was trying to help ease her lingering anxieties. A peaceful weekend away sounded perfect. As they pulled up the curving drive to the inn, Jessica caught her breath. The charming Victorian architecture and surrounding mountains were stunning. At check-in, the friendly clerk told them about the inn's rich history. It had hosted many honored guests over the centuries since its construction in 1892. Jessica felt herself relax as a bellhop showed them to their suite. The cozy octagonal turret room had a beautiful view of the valley. Tyler and Emma eagerly explored while she unpacked their bags. That evening, they bundled up and headed out into the crisp evening to wander the quaint nearby town. A full moon hung over the valley as the kids munched caramel apples. Jessica felt contentment settle over her like a warm blanket. After the children were tucked in that night, Jessica stayed up reading in the quiet suite's small sitting room. She glanced up as the antique clock chimed midnight. Time for bed. As she rose to turn in, something caught her eye through the window. A pale young woman stood on the moonlit balcony, directly below theirs. Why was someone outside so late in the cold? Jessica stared as the woman turned slowly to gaze up at her. Even from a distance, her anguished eyes chilled Jessica to the bone. Chapter 15. Jessica backed away from the window as dread clutched her heart. Something about the lone woman below gave her chills. She hoped it was just her lingering anxiety playing tricks. Unable to shake her unease, Jessica eventually fell into a fitful sleep. All night she tossed and turned, jolting awake repeatedly from unsettled dreams. When golden morning light finally filtered into the suite, she rose feeling exhausted. As she brewed coffee, Jessica peered cautiously through the window. No sign of the woman remained. The kids were eager to hit the indoor pool after breakfast. Jessica forced a smile, trying to appear relaxed. But she couldn't get the watcher's haunting eyes out of her mind. That afternoon, they went into town to explore the local shops. Jessica froze when she noticed the woman peering from across the street, half hidden behind a tree. Their eyes met for a chilling moment before the woman disappeared. Her heart pounding, Jessica hurried the children back to the safety of the inn. She could not escape the feeling they were being followed, even watched from the windows at night. Jessica decided to say something to the friendly clerk who checked them in. As casually as she could, Jessica described the lone woman lingering outside their room at strange hours. The clerk's eyes widened. "Ma'am, are you certain about what you saw?" she asked. Jessica nodded, confused by her reaction. The clerk hesitated before responding carefully. "Forgive me, but our hotel has no other guests fitting that description," she said. "However, legend tells of a distraught young woman named Anna who leapt to her death from your suite over a century ago after losing her fiancé." Jessica's mouth went dry. She suddenly regretted saying anything. The clerk likely thought she was unhinged. Jessica quickly thanked her and hurried away, mind racing. Could the watching woman be the ghost lingering after her tragic end? Jessica shivered, realizing they may be sharing the suite with Anna's tortured spirit. Chapter 16. That night, Jessica lay rigid in the dark suite, listening. A cold breeze stirred the curtains. Outside, the wind whistled through the trees. Halloween was just a week away. At 2 a.m., Jessica jerked awake. A shadow stood by the chwam. Two pale red-rimmed eyes stared out from my gaunt, expressionless face. Heart seized with terror, Jessica fumbled to turn on the bedside lamp with trembling hands. The watcher stood inches from her bed, in a tattered white nightgown, like a corpse risen from its grave. "Why are you here?" Jessica whispered through trembling lips. "This is my room," Anna replied in a hollow, mournful voice. "I want you to leave." Jessica's voice failed. The ghost's sunken eyes bored into her. "He broke off our engagement, so I leapt from that window," she intoned. "Now I wait for his return." Her eyes flickered to the window where she had met her end a century ago. Jessica forced herself to breathe. "I understand your pain," she said gently. "But hurting us will not heal it. You must move on from this place." The ghost's face contorted in anguish. "He is late coming to me," she moaned. "It has been so long." The air chilled around them. Jessica's breath came out in puffs. "Staying here will only bring more suffering," she implored, shaking violently. "Go now and be at peace." The ghost froze, warring with itself. Then, with a thin wail, it faded into the shadows. The room slowly warmed. Jessica buried her head in her pillow, sobbing silently. When would their family be truly free of these tormenting spirits? Chapter 17. Jessica cut their trip short and hurried home. She tearfully told Mark about the encounter. To her relief, he listened with empathy rather than skepticism. "The inn was built around the time we lived in that house," Mark said. "Do you think Anna could be one of the Marshall children?" Jessica considered this. The ghost's antiquated white nightgown did resemble something a child might wear generations ago. Mark shared his research on paranormal activity. Many experts believed ghosts linger due to unfinished business or an inability to accept their own death. "Anna's spirit was trapped reliving her final moments," said Mark. "She needed closure, which you helped provide." Jessica shuddered, recalling the ghost's anguished eyes. "I wonder if speaking with Anna's spirit freed the Marshall children too," Mark murmured. "Perhaps they're all finally at peace, including our family." Jessica clung to this hope. She knew they would never stop looking over their shoulders. But each small act of courage brought more light into the darkness that lingered inside them all. The next morning brought comforting news. Jessica opened a local paper to read that demolition had begun on the old mansion. Soon, no trace of that evil place would remain. Jessica stepped outside into the sunny yard where Grace played. Their new home felt warm and safe. She raised her face to the light, letting it soak into her skin. Whatever shadows haunted them, she and Mark would face them together. And the darkness would continue receding, assailed by their ever-growing courage, compassion, and love. Chapter 18. The family thrived as the years passed. Emma and Tyler excelled in school activities. Little Grace grew into an inquisitive, happy-go-lucky 5-year-old. Jessica returned to her career in advertising. Mark was fulfilled by his work researching paranormal phenomena and guiding others experiencing it. The haunting lingered as a dim memory from their past, overshadowed by a warm, full family life. Only sometimes when Jessica heard the wind howl on a dark night would a chill travel down her spine. It was now late October, a beautiful New England autumn. Halloween was tomorrow, and the children could hardly contain their excitement as they raced through piles of leaves in the backyard. That evening after Thanksgiving dinner, the doorbell rang. Emma and Tyler eagerly welcomed their costumed friends for an early trick-or-treat. Music and laughter rang out as Jessica cradled baby Grace, gently swaying to the beat. She smiled as Mark chased the children around with the plastic bowl of candy, a far cry from the terror they once endured on Halloween nights. Jessica's phone buzzed. She stepped out on the back porch to answer it. "Mrs. Harris, this is Detective Wagner." Jessica froze. Mark's research contacts in law enforcement sometimes reached out, but she sensed immediately this call was different. "I wanted to notify you personally that Ronald Hayes passed away last week." Jessica's chest tightened at the officer's name from that fateful day. "We're so very sorry," she managed. After expressing their condolences, Jessica ended the call, hands shaking. She stared up at the full hunter's moon, remembering that good man who tried to save them. He hadn't deserved the evil that took him. Few who encountered it did. With a shiver, she turned back to the warm glow of her home. However long she lived, Jessica would never take this simple joy for granted again. Chapter 19. A few mornings later, Jessica collected the mail, then froze, clutching a letter addressed in an ornate, unfamiliar hand. She stepped back inside and tore it open with trembling fingers. The letter informed her that an anonymous benefactor had gifted the family a beach cottage in North Carolina. Jessica sank into a chair, stunned. Who would give them such an extravagant inheritance? When Mark arrived home, they scrutinized the letter together. It disclosed no specifics on their mysterious benefactor. The estate lawyer claimed only that the donor wished to remain anonymous. "I figured it was some scamp," said Mark. "But I called the lawyer. He's legitimate. The beach house is paid in full. Sign over to us free and clear." Jessica's head spun. She had dreamed of ocean views and sandy toes since they first wed. But such a gift from a stranger was difficult to fathom. What waited for them there? The kids were thrilled at the news, of course. That weekend, they embarked on a road trip down the coast to see their unfathomable windfall for themselves. After a stunning drive beneath blue skies, they crossed a slender bridge onto the exclusive barrier island. Grace squealed as their charming beach cottage came into view. The pale blue hydrangea-lined walkway led up to an airy porch with a commanding ocean view. Inside, sunlight dappled on whitewashed walls and breezy linen curtains. On the kitchen counter sat a bottle of champagne and a note reading, "Welcome home." Jessica's skin prickled. Something about this felt eerily familiar, yet she had never set foot here before. Who had gifted this dream cottage, and why? Jessica wandered the shell-strewn path down to the shore, pondering the mystery as the waves lapped at her toes. Chapter 20. Their first evening in the breathtaking cottage, Mark built a fire in the cozy living room. He opened the gifted champagne bottle and poured 2 glasses. Jessica tucked the children into bed before joining him on the plush sofa. She sighed happily, leaning into his shoulder as they clinked glasses. Later that night, Jessica floated peacefully in a deep sleep, feeling safer than she had in years. When she opened her eyes, it was daylight, but something was different. She stood in a sunny nursery she didn't recognize. A woman hummed nearby, folding infant clothes. When she turned, Jessica stifled a scream. It was Mrs. Marshall, the ghost who had nearly killed her years ago. Jessica turned to flee, but froze when she heard a familiar cry. There in the corner sat Grace, in an antique crib. Mrs. Marshall smiled down at the baby warmly. Jessica's pulse pounded. "Don't be afraid, dear," said Mrs. Marshall in a kindly voice. "I've only come to tell you that you're safe now." She stepped closer to Jessica. "The advocate wished to remain anonymous, but it was I who gifted you this home." Jessica stared, speechless. Mrs. Marshall gazed back gently. "Our family was consumed by grief when we lost our children in its darkness. Our spirits turned vengeful, but your great courage and kindness freed us." Tears filled Jessica's eyes. Mrs. Marshall squeezed her hand. "We are forever in your debt. This is our gift of atonement, so your family will always have sanctuary." Jessica awoke with a gasp. Pale dawn light filtered in. The dream had felt shockingly real. Downstairs, Jessica found the champagne bottle empty on the coffee table where they left it. She stared outside at the pristine beach. Had Grace really slept safely in that nursery? If the dream spoke truth, Mrs. Marshall's tortured spirit had found redemption through Jessica's act of bravery. And she had given Jessica's family the rarest, most precious gift in return: sanctuary. Chapter 21. Jessica told Mark about the vivid dream. Though shocked, he too sensed its deeper meaning. This cottage was a refuge gifted from an unlikely source. They spent the sunny days playing on the breezy beach as a family. The soothing rhythm of the waves washed away lingering darkness. And in the joyful laughter of their children, Jessica and Mark found hope reborn. At night, Jessica slept peacefully, no longer haunted by the events of the past. A sense of protection enveloped her within these walls that had been sanctified through sacrifice and redemption. Mark flourished too, his inner light shining brighter than ever. He spent hours gazing thoughtfully out at the sea, lulled by the harmony of wind and water that whispered ancient truths. With each new sunrise, Jessica felt her spirit lifting higher. This place was truly healing them. Though the ghosts of their memories could never be erased, those shadows were fading in the glow of their rediscovered happiness. When it came time to depart, the children begged to stay longer. Standing on the sunny porch, taking one last look at the glittering ocean view, Jessica's heart ached too. But she knew they would return. This cottage was their refuge now, a sanctuary that bore witness to the spirit's capacity for wisdom, growth, and atonement. Here, their family had found its way home. As the rolling dunes and shimmering tides receded behind them, Jessica gazed ahead with a hopeful heart. Their lives would forever remain interwoven with those whose struggles opened doors to understanding. With compassion as their guide, she and Mark would continue moving steadily into light, journeying away from the darkness of the past and towards a future bright with possibility. Chapter 22. Over the coming years, the cottage became a second home where the family flourished, surrounded by sun, sand, and soothing sea air. Mark took up surfing, finding communion with the ocean's restless yet harmonious spirit. Jessica studied the constellations, feeling connected to timeless cycles larger than herself when gazing at the same stars the house's first inhabitants did. The children made seashell mosaics, built epic sandcastles, and adopted a lanky gray hound who raced with them into the foaming surf each morning. With each visit, Jessica noticed Grace growing more contemplative during their long seaside walks, collecting stones tumbled smooth as eggs by the waves. "Do you think Mrs. Marshall's children come play here?" the girl asked one twilight stroll. Jessica squeezed her hand. "I'm certain their spirits roam here happily now," she said, watching the glinting waves. Grace nodded, skipping stones that skipped out over the shimmering sea to the horizon. When the older kids left for college, Jessica and Mark stayed in their empty nest, settling into a newfound stillness and intimacy. They grew reflective, taking joy in simple moments, sharing coffee on the porch swing, swimming under the stars, waving to neighbors they now knew by name. This place felt like coming home. Sitting together on the back deck one golden evening, looking out over the glassy sea, Jessica asked Mark if he had any regrets. He turned to her. "Only that I once took our life and our capacity for growth for granted," he said. "But that journey led us here." Jessica nestled her head against his shoulder, heart brimming with gratitude. Their path of shadows had led to the light. And now they had come full circle, back to the shimmering sea life's beginning and ever-constant promise. The end.